Marcus Chen had been serving as a royal guard for 8 years, but he had never seen anything like what was happening on this cold Tuesday morning. The palace gates were surrounded by angry protesters, their voices growing louder with each passing minute. What started as a peaceful demonstration about rising food prices had quickly turned into something much more dangerous. The young guard adjusted his uniform nervously as he watched the crowd through the ornate iron bars. Behind him, the palace stood majestically against the gray sky, its golden domes catching what little sunlight managed to break through the clouds. Inside those walls, the royal family was going about their morning routine, completely unaware of the storm brewing just outside their home. Captain Rodriguez, a weathered man with 25 years of service, approached Marcus with a grim expression. His usually pristine uniform showed signs of the long night they had all endured, and his eyes carried the weight of responsibility that came with protecting the most important family in the country. "Chen, I need you to understand something," the captain said quietly, placing a firm hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Today is not going to be like any other day we've faced. These people out there, they're not just upset about bread prices anymore. They're angry at everything, the government, the economy, and unfortunately, they see our royal family as the symbol of all their problems." Marcus nodded solemnly, though his heart was racing. He had joined the royal guard because he believed in serving his country and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The royal family had always been kind to him, treating him with respect despite his humble background. Princess Elena, in particular, had gone out of her way to learn the names of all the guards and often asked about their families. The crowd outside had grown from maybe 50 people at dawn to what looked like several hundred now. Their chants echoed off the palace walls, creating an unsettling rhythm that seemed to match Marcus's heartbeat. "Justice for the people!" they shouted, their fists raised high in the air. Some carried handmade signs with slogans demanding lower taxes and better living conditions. Among the protesters, Marcus could see faces of ordinary citizens, teachers, shop owners, factory workers, and students. These weren't criminals or troublemakers. They were regular people who had reached their breaking point. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd caught his attention. She was crying as she held up a picture of what appeared to be her grandson, probably unable to afford proper medical care for the child. "Sir," Marcus said to Captain Rodriguez, "maybe we should try talking to them. They don't seem like bad people. They're just frustrated and scared about their future." The captain's expression softened slightly. He had been thinking the same thing, but years of military training had taught him to be cautious in situations like this. "I know what you're thinking, Chen, and part of me agrees with you. But my job is to protect the royal family first, and these crowds can turn violent without warning. I've seen it happen before in other countries." As if on cue, a young man near the front of the crowd threw a small stone that clattered harmlessly against the palace gates. The sound was barely audible, but it sent a chill through both guards. What started as a symbolic gesture could quickly escalate into something much more serious. Inside the palace, Princess Elena was having her morning tea when she heard the distant sound of the crowd. She walked to her window and pulled back the heavy curtains, gasping when she saw the sea of people gathered outside her home. Her heart immediately went out to them, recognizing the desperation in their voices. The princess had spent much of her recent time working with local charities and visiting communities affected by the economic downturn. She knew firsthand how difficult life had become for many of her country's citizens. Unlike some members of the royal family who remained isolated from the real world, Elena made it a point to understand the struggles of ordinary people. She quickly dressed and made her way downstairs, determined to speak with Captain Rodriguez about the situation. As she walked through the marble corridors, she could hear her parents and other family members discussing the disturbance in worried tones. Some were calling for immediate action to disperse the crowd, but Elena felt there had to be a better way. Meanwhile, Marcus noticed that some of the protesters were growing more agitated. A group of younger men had started pushing closer to the gates, testing the strength of the barriers. Their leader, a man in his 30s with calloused hands that spoke of years of manual labor, seemed to be trying to keep things peaceful, but even he was struggling to control the growing anger of the crowd. "We just want to be heard," someone shouted from the back. "We're not asking for much, just enough to feed our families and keep our children healthy." Captain Rodriguez received a call on his radio. The voice on the other end was urgent but controlled. Captain, we have reports of similar gatherings forming in 3 other locations around the city. The situation appears to be coordinated, though we don't yet know by whom. This news changed everything. What they were dealing with wasn't just a spontaneous protest, but potentially part of a larger, organized movement. The captain's mind raced as he considered the implications. Were there other groups planning to target the palace? Was this the beginning of something much bigger? Marcus watched as his captain's face grew more serious. He could see the internal struggle playing out in the older man's eyes, the desire to handle the situation peacefully versus the need to prepare for the worst-case scenario. The protesters continued their chants, but Marcus noticed that their voices were becoming hoarse from shouting for so long. Children in the crowd were getting tired and cranky, and some of the elderly protesters were sitting down on the cold pavement. These details made them seem more human, more real to him. As the morning progressed, news crews began arriving on the scene. Cameras and reporters positioned themselves at a safe distance, ready to broadcast whatever happened next to the entire country. This added another layer of pressure to an already tense situation, as everyone knew that their actions would be scrutinized by millions of people. The tension at the palace gates had been building for 3 hours when everything suddenly changed. Marcus was monitoring the crowd when he noticed a commotion near the back of the protesters. A line of black vehicles was approaching slowly, and from his position he could see men in dark suits getting out of the cars. These weren't more protesters. These were government security agents, and they looked like they meant business. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that someone higher up in the government had decided to take control of the situation. This was exactly what Captain Rodriguez had been hoping to avoid. The lead agent, a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes, approached the palace gates with purpose. He flashed his credentials to Captain Rodriguez and spoke in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Captain, I'm Agent Harrison from the National Security Division. We're taking over this operation effective immediately." Captain Rodriguez straightened his shoulders, but Marcus could see the concern in his eyes. "Agent Harrison, with respect, my team has been handling this situation peacefully. The protesters haven't broken any laws, and we believe we can resolve this without escalation." Agent Harrison's expression didn't change. "Captain, you're thinking too small. We have intelligence suggesting this is part of a coordinated attack on government institutions. Similar protests are happening in 4 other cities, and we have reason to believe this could be the beginning of a larger uprising." Marcus exchanged glances with his fellow guards. The word uprising changed everything. If that were true, then they weren't just dealing with frustrated citizens anymore. They were potentially facing a serious threat to national security. Inside the palace, Princess Elena had been watching the situation develop from her window. When she saw the government agents arrive, she knew she had to act quickly. She had always believed that her family's role was to serve the people, not to hide from them when they needed help the most. Against the advice of her security detail, she made her way to the main entrance of the palace. Her personal guard, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, tried to stop her. "Your Highness, it's not safe. The situation outside is becoming unpredictable." Elena paused but didn't turn back. "Sarah, those people out there aren't enemies. They're our citizens and they're suffering. If I can't speak to them when they need to be heard, then what's the point of my position?" The princess had always been different from other members of the royal family. While her siblings attended formal dinners and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, Elena spent her time visiting hospitals, schools, and community centers. She knew the names of single mothers struggling to pay rent and elderly people choosing between medicine and food. Back at the gates, Agent Harrison was briefing his team on their plan of action. Marcus listened with growing unease as the agent outlined a strategy that involved riot gear, water cannons, and potentially tear gas. This was not the peaceful resolution that Captain Rodriguez had been working toward. "Sir," Marcus found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "These protesters have been peaceful all morning. Many of them are families with children. Surely there's a way to address their concerns without using force." Agent Harrison turned his cold gaze on the young guard. "Guard Chen, is it? Let me explain something to you. When people gather in large groups like this, they can become dangerous very quickly. One spark is all it takes to turn a peaceful protest into a violent riot. Our job is to prevent that spark from igniting." Marcus wanted to argue, but Captain Rodriguez gave him a subtle shake of the head. The young guard understood that they were no longer in charge of the situation, and speaking out of turn could make things worse for everyone involved. The protesters, meanwhile, had noticed the arrival of the government agents. The mood in the crowd shifted noticeably. Where there had been hope that their voices might be heard, now there was fear and anger. Parents began pulling their children closer, while younger protesters moved toward the front, ready to defend their right to peaceful assembly. The elderly woman Marcus had noticed earlier was now sitting on a small folding chair someone had brought for her. She looked exhausted and sad, as if she had hoped this day would bring positive change, but was beginning to realize that hope might have been misplaced. A young father holding his daughter on his shoulders caught Marcus's attention. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, was looking around with wide, curious eyes. She didn't understand why so many adults were upset, but she could sense the tension in the air. Her father whispered something in her ear, and she smiled and waved at Marcus through the gates. That simple gesture hit Marcus harder than any political speech or military briefing ever could. This wasn't about politics or security protocols. It was about real people with real problems who had come to the one place they thought might offer them hope. Agent Harrison's radio crackled with updates from other locations around the city. "Agent Harrison, this is Command. We have reports of crowds growing larger at the other sites. Recommend immediate action to prevent coordination between groups." The agent nodded grimly and turned to his team. "Gentlemen, we're moving to Phase 2. I want riot barriers in place and crowd dispersal units ready to deploy in 10 minutes. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. "Agent Harrison, I'm requesting permission to attempt dialogue with the protest leaders before you implement your plan. Give me 15 minutes to try to reach a peaceful resolution." Marcus held his breath, hoping the agent would agree. He had seen Captain Rodriguez handle difficult situations before, and the man had a gift for finding common ground with people from all walks of life. Agent Harrison checked his watch and considered the request. "Captain, you have 10 minutes. But understand this. If there's any sign of violence or if the crowd grows larger, we move immediately to disperse them." As Captain Rodriguez prepared to approach the protesters, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Princess Elena approaching with Lieutenant Mitchell close behind. The princess had managed to make her way to the gates despite the protests of her security team. "Captain," she said quietly, "I'd like to speak with these people. They came here hoping to be heard by the royal family, and I think they deserve that opportunity." The captain's face showed a mixture of admiration and concern. "Your Highness, I appreciate your courage, but Agent Harrison has taken control of this situation. I'm not sure he'll allow direct contact between you and the protesters." Elena's eyes flashed with determination. "Then perhaps it's time Agent Harrison remembered that he works for the people of this country, just like all of us do." Princess Elena's arrival at the gates created an immediate stir among both the protesters and the security personnel. Word spread quickly through the crowd that a member of the royal family had come to speak with them. Marcus watched as faces that had been hardened by anger and frustration suddenly showed glimmers of hope. Agent Harrison was not pleased with this development. He strode over to where the princess stood, his expression stern and uncompromising. "Your Highness, I must insist that you return to the palace immediately. The security situation out here is too unpredictable for direct contact with the protesters." Elena stood her ground, though Marcus could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her nervousness. "Agent Harrison, these people have traveled from across the city to speak with the royal family. They've been peaceful and respectful. I believe I have a responsibility to listen to their concerns." Captain Rodriguez found himself caught between his duty to protect the princess and his growing belief that direct dialogue might be the key to resolving the situation peacefully. He had served long enough to know that force often created more problems than it solved. "Your Highness," the captain said carefully, "perhaps we could arrange for a small delegation of protesters to meet with you in a controlled environment. That way, you could hear their concerns while maintaining appropriate security protocols." Marcus watched the crowd's reaction as news of the princess's presence spread. The angry chanting had died down, replaced by an expectant murmur. People were straining to catch a glimpse of Elena through the ornate iron bars of the gate. The young father with his daughter on his shoulders had moved closer to the front of the crowd. The little girl was pointing excitedly toward the palace, having spotted the princess's distinctive blue dress. Her innocent enthusiasm seemed to cut through the tension that had been building all morning. Agent Harrison spoke into his radio, reporting the new development to his superiors. Marcus couldn't hear the response, but the agent's face grew even more serious. When he finished the call, he turned back to the group at the gates. "I've just received updated intelligence," Harrison announced. "We now have confirmation that today's protests are part of a coordinated effort by anti-government groups. The timing and locations of all 5 demonstrations show clear signs of organization and planning." This revelation sent a chill through Marcus. If the protests were indeed coordinated by groups with anti-government agendas, then the situation was far more dangerous than anyone had initially believed. But looking at the crowd, he still saw mostly ordinary citizens who seemed genuinely concerned about their economic struggles. Elena, however, was not deterred by this news. "Agent Harrison, even if some people are trying to use these protests for their own purposes, that doesn't change the fact that most of these citizens have legitimate grievances. We can't ignore their voices just because others might have different motives." The elderly woman Marcus had been watching earlier had somehow made her way to the very front of the crowd. She was holding a handwritten letter and tears were streaming down her weathered cheeks. Through the gates, she called out to Princess Elena in a voice that was both desperate and dignified. "Your Highness," the woman said, "my name is Margaret Santos. I've lived in this country for 73 years, and I've always respected and supported the royal family. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want you to know that my grandson is sick, and I can't afford his medicine anymore. I don't know what else to do." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she listened to the woman's plea. Without hesitation, she moved closer to the gates, much to Agent Harrison's obvious displeasure. "Mrs. Santos, I hear you and I want to help. Can you tell me more about your situation?" Marcus felt his heart break as he watched this exchange. The distance between the princess and the elderly woman was only a few feet, but the iron bars between them seemed to represent a much larger divide between the royal family and the people they were meant to serve. Captain Rodriguez was monitoring his radio for updates from other locations around the city. The news wasn't encouraging. At 2 of the other protest sites, tensions had escalated, and local police were requesting backup. The peaceful nature of the demonstration at the palace was becoming the exception rather than the rule. Agent Harrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Your Highness, we need to end this now. My teams at other locations are reporting increasingly aggressive behavior from protesters. We can't risk having this crowd turn violent as well." As if summoned by his words, a new group of protesters arrived at the palace gates. Unlike the families and older citizens who had been there all morning, these newcomers appeared younger and more agitated. They carried larger signs with more inflammatory slogans and began pushing toward the front of the crowd. Marcus noticed that the original protesters seemed uncomfortable with the new arrivals. The young father with his daughter quickly moved away from the more aggressive newcomers, and several elderly protesters looked genuinely frightened by the change in atmosphere. The leader of the original group, the man with calloused hands whom Marcus had observed earlier, tried to maintain order. "We're here for peaceful dialogue," he called out to the newcomers. "We don't want any trouble." But the new arrivals seemed to have different ideas. One of them, a young man with angry eyes and clenched fists, shouted toward the palace gates. "We're tired of being ignored. It's time for action, not just words." This outburst sent ripples of unease through both the crowd and the security personnel. Agent Harrison immediately signaled to his team, and Marcus could see riot gear being distributed among the government agents. Princess Elena, however, refused to be intimidated. She stepped even closer to the gates and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried across the crowd. "I understand your frustration, and I want to address your concerns. But we can only do that if we maintain respect for each other and work together peacefully." Her words had a remarkable effect on the crowd. Even some of the newer, more aggressive protesters seemed to calm down slightly at hearing directly from a member of the royal family. Marcus realized that Elena possessed a natural ability to connect with people that went far beyond her royal training. Agent Harrison, however, was not impressed by this display of diplomacy. "Your Highness, with the arrival of these additional protesters, the security risk has increased significantly. I'm implementing crowd dispersal protocols immediately." As he spoke, Marcus could see government vehicles approaching from multiple directions. These weren't the black sedans that had brought Agent Harrison and his team. These were larger, more intimidating vehicles equipped for crowd control. The sight of them caused a visible stir among the protesters. and the peaceful atmosphere that Elena had been working to maintain began to deteriorate rapidly. Captain Rodriguez made a final attempt to prevent the situation from escalating. "Agent Harrison, give us just a few more minutes. Princess Elena is making real progress with these people. If we can arrange for a small group to meet with her safely, we might be able to resolve this without any use of force." But Agent Harrison had already made his decision. "Captain, my orders are clear. This crowd has grown beyond manageable limits, and we have confirmed intelligence about coordinated anti-government activities. We're moving to disperse them now." The moment Agent Harrison gave the order to disperse the crowd, everything changed. Marcus watched in growing alarm as government agents in riot gear began forming lines behind protective barriers. The peaceful dialogue that Princess Elena had been fostering was about to be shattered by what looked like the beginning of a military operation. The protesters sensed the shift immediately. Parents grabbed their children and began moving toward the back of the crowd. The elderly woman, Mrs. Santos, looked around in confusion and fear as younger protesters pushed past her in their urgency to either leave or position themselves for what might come next. Princess Elena was horrified by what she saw unfolding. "Agent Harrison, this is completely unnecessary. These people aren't threatening anyone. They just want to be heard." But the agent was no longer listening to her protests. His radio crackled with reports from around the city. "Command to Agent Harrison. Situation at Location 3 has turned violent. Protesters have broken through police barriers. Military backup has been requested. Recommend immediate action at all sites." Marcus felt his blood run cold. Military backup meant this situation was about to escalate far beyond anything they had prepared for. He looked at Captain Rodriguez, who appeared equally stunned by this development. The captain grabbed his own radio and tried to contact his superiors at Palace Security. "Command, this is Captain Rodriguez at the main gate. We have the situation under control here. Princess Elena is conducting peaceful dialogue with protesters. Request delay of any aggressive action." The response came back immediately. "Captain Rodriguez, Agent Harrison is now in command of all security operations. Follow his directives immediately." Elena refused to back down. Despite the obvious danger of the situation, she remained at the gates, speaking calmly to the crowd. "Please, everyone, stay calm. I promise you that your voices will be heard. We don't need to let fear take control of this situation." Her courage was remarkable, but Marcus could see that it might not be enough to prevent what was coming. The newer, more aggressive protesters were becoming increasingly agitated by the sight of riot gear and government vehicles. Some were shouting challenges at the agents, while others were picking up stones and debris from the street. The original protesters, the families and working people who had come seeking dialogue, were caught in the middle. They didn't want violence, but they also didn't want to abandon the opportunity to finally be heard by someone in power. Many looked torn between staying to support Princess Elena's efforts and leaving to protect themselves and their families. Agent Harrison raised a megaphone and addressed the crowd. "This is an official order to disperse. You have 10 minutes to leave this area voluntarily. After that time, we will use all necessary means to clear this location." The ultimatum sent shockwaves through the crowd. Some protesters immediately began leaving, especially those with children, but others, particularly the newer arrivals, seemed energized by the challenge. They moved closer to the palace gates, shouting defiant slogans. Marcus noticed something that filled him with dread. Among the more aggressive protesters, he spotted several individuals who didn't seem to fit with the others. They were better dressed, more organized, and they appeared to be giving instructions to some of the younger protesters. These might be the coordinators that Agent Harrison had been warning about. Captain Rodriguez saw them too. "Agent Harrison," he called out, "there are individuals in that crowd who appear to be organizing the more aggressive elements. If we can identify and isolate them, we might be able to prevent this from turning violent." But Agent Harrison was focused on his timeline. 6 minutes remaining, he announced through the megaphone. "This is your final warning to disperse peacefully." Princess Elena was desperately trying to maintain dialogue with the crowd. She had managed to speak with several of the original protesters, including Mrs. Santos, and was working to understand their specific concerns. Her personal aide had been taking notes, documenting the issues that could potentially be addressed through proper channels. "Mrs. Santos," Elena said gently, "I want to help with your grandson's medical expenses. Can you give my aide your contact information so we can arrange assistance?" The elderly woman's face lit up with hope and gratitude. "Your Highness, I never expected. I just wanted someone to listen. Thank you so much." But their touching exchange was interrupted by shouting from another part of the crowd. One of the suspected organizers had begun rallying the younger protesters, urging them to stand their ground and fight for their rights. His rhetoric was becoming increasingly inflammatory. Marcus watched as the peaceful crowd began to split into distinct groups. The families and older citizens were moving away from the gates, while the younger, more aggressive protesters were moving closer. The division was creating exactly the kind of chaos that could lead to violence. Agent Harrison's countdown continued. 3 minutes remaining. Final warning. That's when Princess Elena made a decision that shocked everyone present. Instead of retreating to the safety of the palace as everyone expected, she stepped forward and placed her hand on the palace gate latch. "Your Highness?" "No," Lieutenant Mitchell called out, moving to stop her, but Elena was determined. "If these people want to be heard by the royal family, then I'm going to listen to them properly. I'm going out there." The announcement sent panic through the security personnel. Captain Rodriguez immediately stepped in front of the gate. "Princess Elena, I cannot allow you to put yourself in danger. The crowd is becoming unpredictable and we can't guarantee your safety." Agent Harrison was furious. "Your Highness, if you leave the security of the palace grounds, I will have no choice but to implement immediate crowd control measures to protect you. That means riot gear, tear gas, and potentially much worse." Elena paused, understanding the terrible choice she was being forced to make. If she stayed behind the gates, the crowd would likely be dispersed violently. If she went out to meet with them, she might trigger an even more aggressive response from the security forces. The standoff lasted for several tense seconds. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that something crucial was happening at the gates. Even the more aggressive protesters had stopped their chanting, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus found himself holding his breath. He had never witnessed such a moment of pure moral courage. Princess Elena was literally standing between her people and the forces that might harm them, willing to risk her own safety to prevent violence. That's when they all heard it, the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching from the distance. Agent Harrison's radio erupted with activity. "Agent Harrison, this is command. Military units are en route to your location. ETA 5 minutes." The sound of approaching aircraft sent the crowd into a new level of agitation. What had started as a peaceful protest was about to become something entirely different. Marcus realized that in just 5 minutes everything would change forever. The sound of military helicopters growing louder overhead created an atmosphere of complete chaos. Marcus had never experienced anything like it during his 8 years as a royal guard. The peaceful morning demonstration had transformed into what looked like the beginning of a military operation, and he felt powerless to stop the escalation. Princess Elena stood frozen at the palace gates, her hand still on the latch. The weight of her decision was enormous: open the gates and risk triggering a massive security response, or stay behind the barriers and watch as peaceful protesters were potentially harmed by overwhelming force. Agent Harrison was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating with the incoming military units. "Command, this is Harrison. We have a member of the royal family at the main gate attempting to make contact with protesters. Need immediate instructions on protection protocols." The response crackled back through the radio, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Agent Harrison, protect the royal family at all costs. If Princess Elena attempts to leave the secure perimeter, you are authorized to use any means necessary to ensure her safety, including immediate crowd dispersal." Marcus felt sick to his stomach. The situation had spiraled completely out of control, and innocent people were going to get hurt. He looked at Captain Rodriguez, who appeared to be struggling with the same realization. The crowd outside had heard the helicopters too, and their reaction was mixed. Many of the families with children were now genuinely frightened and trying to leave the area as quickly as possible. But the more militant protesters seemed energized by the military presence, viewing it as proof that their demonstration was having an impact. Mrs. Santos, the elderly woman who had been speaking with Princess Elena, was caught in the middle of the chaos. She was too old to move quickly, and the surging crowd around her was making it difficult for her to find a way out. Marcus watched with growing concern as she was jostled by people moving in different directions. "Captain Rodriguez," Marcus called out. "Mrs. Santos is in danger out there." The crowd is getting too chaotic for someone her age to navigate safely. The captain saw what Marcus was referring to and immediately understood the problem. Agent Harrison, we have an elderly civilian in distress in the crowd. Request permission to provide assistance. But Agent Harrison was completely focused on the military coordination. Negative, Captain. All personnel maintain positions until military units arrive. Princess Elena had been watching Mrs. Santos as well, and seeing the elderly woman's distress made her decision for her. Without another word, she unlatched the palace gate and stepped outside the secure perimeter. Your Highness, Lieutenant Mitchell shouted, moving to follow her. The moment Elena left the palace grounds, everything exploded into motion. Agent Harrison immediately activated his emergency protocols. All units, the princess is outside the secure perimeter. Implement immediate protection formation. Government agents in riot gear began moving toward the crowd, their shields raised and weapons ready. The sight of armed personnel advancing toward them caused panic among the protesters. What had been a relatively organized crowd suddenly became a chaotic mass of people trying to move in different directions. But Princess Elena was not deterred. She walked directly toward Mrs. Santos, who was now sitting on the ground, overwhelmed by the chaos around her. Elena knelt beside the elderly woman and spoke to her gently. Mrs. Santos, I'm here. Let me help you get somewhere safe. The image of the princess kneeling beside an elderly protester, while armed agents advanced around them, was captured by the news cameras that had been covering the event. That single moment would later become one of the most iconic images in the country's recent history. Marcus watched in amazement as Princess Elena helped Mrs. Santos to her feet and began escorting her toward a safer area away from the advancing security forces. Other protesters, seeing the princess's act of compassion, began helping elderly and disabled individuals in the crowd. The young father with his daughter, who Marcus had been watching earlier, was also trying to help. He had given his daughter to his wife and was now assisting an elderly man who was having trouble walking. Despite the chaos and fear, people were still looking out for each other. Agent Harrison was becoming increasingly frustrated with the situation. His carefully planned security operation was being undermined by acts of human kindness that he couldn't control or predict. Princess Elena, you must return to the palace immediately. The military units will be here in 2 minutes. But Elena continued helping Mrs. Santos, seemingly oblivious to the warnings. As they walked, she spoke quietly to the elderly woman. Mrs. Santos, I promise you that we will address your grandson's medical needs. But right now I need to get you somewhere safe. The helicopters were now directly overhead, and the noise was deafening. Marcus could see military vehicles approaching from multiple directions. What had started as a simple protest was about to become a full-scale military intervention. Captain Rodriguez made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of following Agent Harrison's orders to maintain position, he stepped outside the palace gates and began helping to evacuate civilian protesters who were in danger of being caught in the middle of whatever was about to happen. Chen, Williams, Patterson, he called to his guards. Help get these civilians to safety. That's our real job here, protecting people. Marcus didn't hesitate. He left his post at the gates and joined his captain in helping protesters move away from the advancing security forces. The other royal guards followed suit, abandoning their defensive positions to assist with civilian evacuation. Agent Harrison was beside himself with fury. Captain Rodriguez, you are in direct violation of orders. Return your men to their positions immediately. But the captain ignored him. Agent Harrison, our primary duty is to protect people, not to follow orders that put innocent civilians in harm's way. The first military vehicles arrived just as Princess Elena successfully guided Mrs. Santos to a safe area behind the news crews. The elderly woman was crying, but now her tears were of gratitude rather than desperation. Your Highness, she said, I never imagined that someone like you would care about someone like me. You've given me hope that things can get better. Elena hugged the elderly woman gently. Mrs. Santos, people like you are exactly who I should care about. You're what makes this country great. But their moment of connection was interrupted by the arrival of military personnel. Soldiers in full combat gear began deploying around the palace, creating a perimeter that dwarfed anything the royal guards or government agents had established. The colonel in charge of the military operation approached Agent Harrison for a briefing. Agent Harrison, what's the situation here? We were told this was a potential terrorist threat. Harrison looked around at the scene. Peaceful protesters helping each other evacuate, royal guards assisting elderly civilians, and Princess Elena comforting a crying grandmother. It was hardly the coordinated attack on government institutions that his superiors had described. "Colonel," he said slowly, "the situation may not be exactly what we were led to believe." Colonel James Mitchell, a veteran military officer with 30 years of experience, surveyed the scene with growing confusion. He had been briefed about a coordinated terrorist attack on government facilities, but what he saw before him looked nothing like what he had been told to expect. The protesters were helping each other evacuate safely. Royal guards were assisting elderly civilians, and at the center of it all, Princess Elena was providing comfort to a crying grandmother while news cameras captured every moment. This was not the scene of a terrorist operation. "Agent Harrison," the colonel said carefully, "can you explain to me why we have deployed military units against what appears to be a peaceful demonstration?" Agent Harrison's face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. His carefully planned operation had fallen apart, and now he was being questioned by a military officer who clearly saw through the exaggerated threat assessment. "Colonel, we received intelligence about coordinated anti-government activities. The timing and scale of these protests suggested organized opposition groups." Colonel Mitchell looked around again, taking in the full picture. "Agent Harrison, I see elderly people, families with children, and working-class citizens expressing legitimate grievances. Where exactly are these organized opposition groups you mentioned?" Marcus, who had been helping evacuate protesters, overheard this exchange and felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone in authority was asking the right questions about what had really happened here. Princess Elena, having ensured that Mrs. Santos was safe, approached the colonel and Agent Harrison. Her dress was dusty from kneeling on the ground, and her hair was disheveled from the wind created by the helicopters. But she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, "I want to thank you for your service to our country. But I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about the nature of today's events." The colonel removed his helmet respectfully. "Your Highness, can you tell me what you've observed here today?" Elena gestured toward the crowd of protesters, many of whom were still watching from a safe distance. "These people came here because they're struggling to survive in our economy. They're not terrorists or revolutionaries. They're citizens who felt they had nowhere else to turn for help." Marcus watched as the colonel processed this information. He could see the older man's expression changing as he began to understand that the military deployment had been based on flawed intelligence and overreaction by government security agencies. Captain Rodriguez approached the group, having finished helping the last of the elderly protesters reach safety. "Colonel, sir, I've been monitoring this situation since dawn. These protesters have been peaceful throughout the morning. The only escalation occurred when government agents arrived with riot gear." Agent Harrison tried to defend his actions. "Captain Rodriguez, you're forgetting the coordinated nature of these protests across multiple cities. That level of organization suggests," Colonel Mitchell interrupted, "that people throughout our country are facing similar economic hardships. Coordination doesn't automatically mean conspiracy, Agent Harrison." The colonel turned to Princess Elena. "Your Highness, what do you think would be the best way to resolve this situation?" Elena looked thoughtful for a moment, glancing back at the protesters who were still gathered at a respectful distance. "Colonel, I believe these people deserve to have their voices heard by their government, not dismissed or dispersed, but actually heard and addressed." Mrs. Santos, despite her age and the stress of the morning, had approached the group. She walked slowly but with determination, still carrying the handwritten letter she had brought to the palace. "Your Highness," she said quietly, "I want to thank you for what you did today. For the first time in years, I feel like someone in power actually cares about people like me." Her words had a profound impact on everyone present, including Colonel Mitchell. The veteran officer had spent his career defending his country, but he had rarely seen such a direct example of leadership serving the people rather than simply maintaining order. The colonel made a decision that would later be praised by historians and political analysts. "Agent Harrison, I'm ordering the immediate withdrawal of all military units from this location. This is not a terrorist situation, and military force is not appropriate here." Agent Harrison was shocked. "Colonel, you don't have the authority to override my security operation." Colonel Mitchell's expression hardened. Agent Harrison, I have the authority to refuse to deploy military assets against peaceful civilians. And that's exactly what I'm doing. The colonel turned to Princess Elena. Your Highness, would it be possible to arrange for a proper meeting between representatives of these protesters and relevant government officials? It seems to me that dialogue is what's needed here, not force. Elena's face lit up with hope. Colonel, I think that's exactly what we should do. These people have legitimate concerns that deserve serious attention. Marcus felt a wave of emotion wash over him as he watched this exchange. After hours of escalating tension and the threat of violence, reason and compassion were finally prevailing. The young guard realized he was witnessing something historic, a moment when people chose understanding over conflict. The news cameras had captured the entire sequence of events, from Princess Elena's brave decision to leave the palace gates, to the military's wise choice to withdraw rather than engage peaceful protesters. The images would be broadcast around the world, showing a different model of how governments could respond to civil unrest. As the military vehicles began their withdrawal, the atmosphere around the palace changed completely. The protesters, no longer facing the threat of violent dispersal, began organizing themselves into smaller groups to discuss their specific concerns and how they might be addressed through proper channels. Marcus watched as Princess Elena continued to move among the crowd, listening to individual stories and taking notes about specific problems that could potentially be solved. Her courage had not only prevented violence but had opened the door to real dialogue between the government and its citizens. Captain Rodriguez gathered his guards together. Gentlemen, today we learned something important about our real mission. We're not here just to protect buildings or follow orders blindly. We're here to serve the people of this country, even when that means questioning authority. The young father with his daughter, who Marcus had been watching throughout the day, approached the group of guards. Officers, I want to thank you for helping keep everyone safe today. You showed real courage when you chose to help people instead of just following orders. As the sun began to set over the palace, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary day he had witnessed. What started as a potential disaster had become a powerful example of how courage, compassion, and wisdom could overcome fear and misunderstanding. Mrs. Santos was among the last protesters to leave the palace grounds. Before departing, she approached Marcus personally. Young man, I saw how you helped people today. Your parents should be proud of the man you've become. Her words stayed with Marcus long after she had gone. He realized that this day had changed him fundamentally. He would never again be content to simply follow orders without considering their moral implications. Like Princess Elena, he had learned that true service meant putting people's welfare above personal safety or career advancement. In the days that followed, the events at the palace would lead to significant policy changes and the establishment of new channels for citizen input into government decision-making. But for Marcus, the most important lesson was simpler and more personal. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is to choose compassion over compliance, understanding over authority, and service over self-interest.